Okay, all your grades are up, by the way, on Moodle for test and then the Symbio Darwinian snails. Okay? You all did pretty good on the test. Yeah, I'm proud of you. So we're going to get into cells and different kinds of molecules and nutrients. I want to go over a little bit of something kind of about disease and medicine. The Greeks, and actually they got it from the, I think, Ayurveda in India, about idea of humors, the four humors. And they were each associated with different characteristics. And yellow bile, fire, black bile is earth, phlegm is water, blood is air. And supposedly disease was caused when these humors got out of balance. So that's why they used to commonly bleed people. They had too much blood. Not so much. And they used to also, a lot of people used to take emetics, or these things that would really clear out the GI tract. That was like a big deal. And that was pretty much passed all the way down, in through the Arab world and all that, and all the way up into Europe, and that was prevailing view up until, probably at least the 18th and probably 19th century. But around the time of the Renaissance, there was a guy named William Harvey, among others, who started looking at corpses and cutting them up and trying to figure out what was going on with them. And he kind of worked out the circulatory system and things like that. But people really didn't know much about what made up living things. And then a guy named Robert Hooke in the mid-17th century, people had developed a microscope before then, but he finally had one made that was pretty good. And he could see a whole lot of things very clearly. And this is one of those we talked about earlier about scientific progress. And a lot of times, scientific progress awaits some new way of seeing something that you weren't aware of before. So we had all of these theories about what life was, the spark of life, all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until Hooke actually saw a cell, plant cells actually, and he drew them, that the whole idea that bodies are made up of cells. And they knew about little microorganisms too, they could see those. And so it was a kind of a wake-up call. Okay, so any ideas? I want like a definition of life. Anybody? Okay, that's good. Okay, anything else besides reproduction? Anything?
Survival.
Huh?
Survival.
Survival? Okay. Okay. Something else? Huh? Death? Okay.
The existence of an individual.
Huh?
The existence of an individual.
Of an individual. Okay. Oops. Okay. What about energy? Does living things need energy?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So that's a good start. What are living organisms made of?
Cells.
Cells, right. Okay. That's a good start. Now, here's some cells. Some bacilli on the left. I'm not sure, it's probably some kind of cocci in the middle, and then, what are these? It looks like eggs. And what about viruses? Now that's been a big debate, whether viruses are actually alive. They don't have their own metabolism like cells do. But that's not surprising because they're parasites. And parasites live off a host. So if you don't have to worry about a metabolism, you just infect a cell that does and take it over and have the cell do the work for the virus. So, but there's still a debate about it. And then there's also, they've been discovering these gigantic viruses. Instead of having like 10 genes, like a lot of viruses do, 10 or 20 at the most, they've got like 500. And they might even have a little metabolism on their own too. So that's kind of in flux. So the question is, what's a cell? And we'll start with cell theory. Now, cell theory, of course, couldn't even be posed as a theory until people actually saw cells, right? And that it took until Robert Hooke to actually describe them for the first time. But cell theory was finally developed kind of more formally in the 19th century. And it had three kind of tenets or principles. All living things are composed of one or more cells. And then the virus stuff here. The cell is a basic unit of structure or an organization in organisms. And then cells come from pre-existing cells. They just don't pop into existence. Kind of like descent from a common ancestor that we were discussing earlier. Now, there's another thing about life that's kind of interesting. Life is a homeostatic system. That means it's a closed system that's actively regulated to remain very nearly constant. Constant temperatures, for the most part, constant amounts of water, something that doesn't vary a lot. So instead of like a rock and you put it in, you know, and it gets really cold at night, it gets cold, and then during the day it warms up, all that. Living organisms have a homeostatic system, and it not only regulates, obviously, temperature, but pH, which is whether it's alkaline or acidic. And then there's a lot of ions that we use, and especially in nerves, well, in everything. And what ions are is normally we think of an element like H2O. And the thing is, water, it splits apart kind of in solution, and you actually end up with hydrogen ions, which is just a single proton with a plus charge because there's no electron there. And then a hydroxyl group, which is OH, oxygen and a hydrogen, and that's negative. Well, these ions have charges, and it's very useful when you set up, like, let's say, a gradient between high concentration and low concentration. You can do the same thing with ions so that they flow in a certain direction and they can get things done. So, and then as far as things that are alive now, we have basically 3 domains. We have a bacterial domain. This is a tree of life. It's actually a phylogeny, right? Where here's animals. It turns out it looks like that we're fairly close to fungi and plants, but we're close to fungi, but plants are far away in terms of what they're most related to. So, and then of course we have this common ancestor down here. Probably a common ancestor was some bacteria that was able to make energy itself, probably through a chemosynthetic process, and then photosynthetic. But there's also this archaea domain, and they are also single-cell organisms. They have a different cell wall than bacteria do, and a number of other things. And it turns out that this node here, they're more closely related to eukaryote, which are what we are, eukaryotes, than they are to bacteria, even though they look like bacteria in that they don't have a nucleus. So archaea and bacteria don't have a nucleus, eukarya do. Okay? There's some talk about another domain of life regarding viruses and where they come in. But we'll not get into that right now. Here's some various kinds of cells. First of all, we've got some viruses down here. They're very small, except for these giant mimiviruses that they've been discovering that are very large. They're about the same size as a bacteria, or even some large bacteria. There's this is a cyanobacteria. Used to be called blue-green algae, but it's actually a bacteria. And it's photosynthetic. Makes its own energy in the form of long carbon chains. E. coli, rods, bacteria. Now, it says here prokaryotes. It's a description meaning not having a nucleus. but it is not a real grouping of organisms in terms of phylogeny. Because remember I said that archaea is actually more closely related to eukarya, which has a nucleus, than bacteria, right? So they still use prokaryotes, meaning without a nucleus, but those two groups, archaea and bacteria, are really very, very, very different groups. And then, there's staph. And then, of course, here we have a eukaryotic cell. And it's got a whole bunch of stuff in it. That's mitochondria. So, why did I do that twice? I don't need it. Okay. So, now, all cells, as you can see up on top, I kind of crossed out prokaryote. All cells have a plasma membrane. And as you can imagine, this is central to the idea of homeostasis. Within a closed area that keeps certain things out and certain things in, and the things that are in a certain balance so that life can persist. And it does it with something called a phospholipid bilayer. And what that means is okay, this is the membrane, this whole thing, right? Okay. Now, inside here, in the bottom, is the cytoplasm of the cell, and outside is outside the cell. There's all these proteins for letting things in and out. There's cholesterol, which is an important part of cell membrane. There's glycoproteins for taking in glucose, and various other things. The thing to remember is that actually, let's do that. Okay. Up there is a hydrophilic tail. Hydrophilic means water-loving. Okay? So it can interact with water, and it can actually let water in from the outside. But down here, we actually have a hydrophobic tail made of lipids, which are fats. And that keeps the water out. So the only way water can actually get in is through these protein channels. So this is the basic thing of what a membrane is, and all cells that we've been talking about have a membrane of some kind. And this is the basic, the way the basic things that they're made of. Okay. Now, bacteria and archaea, what we called prokaryotes in the past, they don't have a nucleus and they don't have any other subcellular membrane, organelles. An organelle is something that's smaller inside that does something. So, right here we have nice bacteria with a flagellum so that it can move around. Not all bacteria have flagellums. It looks like maybe the first ones kind of did. And then if we look at a eukaryotic cell, we can see, so we have this nucleus here, right? And then we also have, where is it? we have these things, and those are mitochondria. And mitochondria are the power plants of cells. Not all cells. Bacteria don't have them because they don't have any organelles. And mitochondria, they do what's called cellular respiration, which we're going to get to in a bit. But they actually are, their ancestor was a kind of bacteria. It started out as like a symbiotic bacteria, or maybe it was engulfed by a cell, bacteria engulfed by, let's say, an archaea, and instead of destroying the bacteria and the archaea kind of got along, and they got things, they both gained something from it. The mitochondria, which was a bacteria, got a safe place, and then the bigger cell had a new way of making energy much more efficiently. And then there's a whole bunch of other things for, like endoplasmic reticulum, that it happens, it's kind of a way to modify proteins. Okay, so proteins. It turns out we're protein. Our DNA is an instruction manual for making proteins. So you have, as I mentioned, you don't have a gene that gives you a certain trait. It gives you certain proteins that then are actual traits, right? And our body uses proteins for a whole slew of things. One of them is like signaling proteins. So on the outside of a cell, they have these proteins that kind of talk to each other, to adjacent cells and things like that, or through hormones. They have transport proteins that move molecules within and between cells, often in conjunction with a fat or a lipid, like cholesterol. They are cytoskeletal proteins. That means inside of a cell, they kind of give a cell a scaffolding and a foundation. Obviously, the immune system are all proteins, receptor proteins, and then enzymes actually catalyze chemical reactions. And living things, basically, we're chemistry, if you really want to get down to it. Interactions between molecules follow the same laws of physical chemistry. Now, enzymes, what they do is they actually lower what's called the activation energy that you need to carry out a chemical reaction. So, let's say fire is a chemical reaction. You'd have a long carbon chain, let's say a piece of wood, and fire breaks apart all the bonds and releases all this energy. But it takes a way to get it started. Well, with enzymes, they lower the amount of energy you need to put in the system to get it started. Okay. Now, they catalyze reactions inside our cells, outside our cells. A good example is one of our favorites, the one that breaks down alcohol so that we can drink large quantities, right? Alcohol dehydrogenase. Whenever you see that ASE, you know it's an enzyme. You have lactase that breaks down lactose, which is the sugars in milk, made up of two independent sugars, glucose and galactose. And then a lot of enzymes catalyze DNA in terms of how it's being transcribed and translated. And we can actually look at it like this. This is the enzyme itself. This is the molecule in milk. And there's these different areas, and the molecules actually fit inside these areas. These are substrates. And suddenly you end up with, so the yellow one is glucose, and the blue one is galactose. Okay? And our cells need glucose. And galactose can also be used as an energy source, but glucose is the main one. Now, anybody in here who's lactose intolerant? You can all drink milk? Okay. There are people, of course, lots of people who are lactose intolerant, and it makes a lot of sense. When do mammals usually drink milk? When they're little, right? Little babies. Okay. Great food source. The thing is, at some point, mama says that's enough and kicks the babies out, weans them. And so adults, essentially, after they've been weaned, juveniles and then adults, they actually stop making lactase to break down milk, because lactase is an enzyme that's expensive to make, and why would you make something like that expensive if you're not going to use it anymore? Well, it turns out that some cultures, they were pastoral, where they had sheep and goats and maybe cattle, things like that. Those animals produce milk, and I'm sure some people tried to drink it in times when there wasn't a lot of food. And there was, at least in one place, there was someone who had a mutation that kept the lactase gene on into adulthood and could drink milk, whereas everybody else couldn't. And that mutation spread throughout that whole population, so that everybody in that population eventually ended up with that gene and they could do milk. And it's the lactase gene that makes lactase, the enzyme, doesn't change. It's the promoter region up above it, that we'll look at it a little bit, that actually turns on and off a gene. And so there was a mutation in the promoter region, and it happened at least 3 different times within the last 10,000 years. Looks like in the Middle East, in Africa twice, and maybe separately in Northern Europe. And then you have a whole bunch of populations where they didn't have that herding culture, and they really didn't have access to milk. And those people are the ones that tend to be lactose intolerant, pretty much including East Asians and Native Americans in North and South America. Now, obviously, since then, it's spread around, but that's pretty much what's going on there. Thank you. Okay, we have an amine group, which is made of, there's the nitrogen in there, carboxyl group, you don't have to know, but this is the basic structure of an amino acid. There's 20 of them that we use. And basically, for proteins, what you do is you string a whole bunch of amino acids together, and that's what the DNA codes for. Amino acids, which are in turn strung together into proteins, different proteins. And so here's a protein. Proteins generally have a 3-dimensional shape. And they have to have that shape for them to do their specific work. Like enzymes have a substrate where the reactions take place. Okay, so amino acids are coded for by DNA. They're transcribed, which we'll get to later, into RNA, and then the RNA is translated into proteins, amino acids. So here's some of our favorite proteins. That is not a very good steak. A good steak is a ribeye or something like that that's really thick, right? And that has a fair amount of marbling fat in it so that it has really nice taste. This is worthless. Now, nuts have lots of proteins. Dairy has proteins. Of course, there's protein bars. They don't actually grow anywhere. You have to make them. But we actually eat proteins, mainly because well, first of all, we can't just make all of our amino acids from scratch. We do most of them, actually. We code, the DNA codes for certain amino acids. But there's some that we actually have to get elsewhere. And the amino acids that we cannot make out of the 27 of them are called essential amino acids. Okay. That means we have to get it from our diet. So these are non-essential right here. We actually make those. These are conditionally essential. We make some, but we usually get some from the diet as well. And these are the ones that we can't make and we have to get from our diet. So we need those amino acids. Anybody, I'm sure you guys, a lot of you have Thanksgiving, right? You maybe have turkey. You know how after a big Thanksgiving dinner, a lot of people kind of get sleepy, right? You just got your kind of stuff and you just want to fall asleep. And then you sleep for a while and then you wake up and eat more. Right? That's what happens. Okay. Well, it's been hypothesized that tryptophan, which is an amino acid that's an essential one, tryptophan is actually part of, needed for the pathway to make a couple of neurotransmitters, serotonin and then melatonin. And these are hormones that actually affect sleep. And it's thought that, well, turkey has a lot of tryptophans, and therefore, when we eat a lot of turkey, we get sleepy. Now, remember the scientific method? Okay. I always get sleepy when I eat turkey. We know that tryptophan is a precursor for sleep-inducing hormones. So why do I get sleepy? Hypothesis. Here's an explanation. The tryptophan in turkey causes my sleepiness. And what predictions does that actually make? So what's the predictions? Set it up there. Right. One of the predictions, of course, is that a food with lots of tryptophan should make you sleepy. And if turkey is, in fact, one of those foods, it should have high tryptophan compared to other things. Okay? So that's the prediction that we're going to look at. And we're going to test that just by measuring the tryptophan in it. So, as you can see in this table, These are proteins, grams per 100 grams of food. And then tryptophan, in terms of grams per 100 grams of food. And then the actual ratio of tryptophan to the rest of the protein. Okay, now, and then you can actually see these various levels. So we've got eggs have, what is it? Oh, let's see, 1.10 grams of protein, or grams 0.1, whatever it is, 0.161, that's it. Tryptophan has 1 gram per 100 grams of food, and the ratio is 1.23. So they have a fair amount. We go down here to pumpkin seeds, 1.72. And pumpkin seeds have a lot of tryptophan. I don't remember getting sleepy from that. And then sesame seeds have really high, in terms of percentage, 2.17. Now, where's my, where is it? A turkey. Okay, right there. So here's turkey. And let's take a look at the percentage. And it is, what is it? Yeah, 1.11. Okay? It doesn't have a lot of tryptophan. We just falsified the hypothesis, right? Now, there might be other things in turkey that make us sleepy, but why do you really think we get sleepy?
We overeat.
Yeah. I mean, all the blood goes to our stomach instead of our head. We can't think anymore. We just kind of like zone out, right? You get the same effect from, let's say, heroin, right? No. So, so it turns out that if you, it's not because of tryptophan. Okay. Now, there's other things that we do need also that are essential, that we can't get, that we can't make. One of them is vitamins, and vitamins actually help enzymes work. They're called oftentimes coenzymes or cofactors. And by definition, we can't make them, except actually for vitamin D. If you are out in the sun, you can actually make vitamin D and folate. And that's why we have different skin colors in terms of how much sun different populations get. So oftentimes in northern populations, you have less pigmentation, and you can make vitamin D this way. African Americans have a hard time making enough vitamin D, or other people with dark skin like Australians. So anywhere where there's like tropical direct sun. But of course the sun is a lot stronger, so they make enough. Okay? So these vitamins are really important. How many in here people actually take vitamins? Okay. So, generally, if you have a decent diet, you get all the vitamins you actually need. The vitamin industry is part of this, supplements industry, and it's all a scam for the most part. Now, if you lived, let's say you lived in South Sudan and you were starving, well, you probably wouldn't be getting enough vitamins in your diet, and then you should probably take a supplement. But in that situation, the main thing is you need enough calories to survive long enough to suffer from vitamin deficiency. right? Okay. They've actually done studies that show, in terms of vitamins, between people who just get it from the diet, people who take vitamins, and what they eat, and then I think that's the controlled. And they actually found out that people are healthier, the ones that just get it from their diet. So there's something else in the diet besides just vitamins. Now, of course, if someone's not making enough or getting enough vitamins, it's important. You should probably take some vitamins, but I think they're generally a scam. Unless maybe you eat, I don't know, even Big Macs. You know, they have some lettuce and tomatoes, not much, but some, right? Okay, so now, we talked about vitamin C before, about, you know, perhaps vitamin C makes us have colds, right? Doesn't work, but at one time, you can get vitamin C in citrus fruits. And in the old days, merchant ships, what they do is they go down to the wharf. There'd be all these sailors that are totally drunk. They'd pick them up if they were not standing, and they'd put them on the ship and they'd sail away, and then they wake up and of course they're suddenly on a ship. And many of those sailors, they didn't carry citrus fruit or anything like that. They had hardtack and salt pork. That was their diet. And eventually a lot of them would come down with a situation where their teeth are falling out, the skin gets rough, the connective tissue is like, everything's falling apart. And then someone discovered that people who actually had citrus didn't have this happen, so the British started stocking their ships with limes. And that's why British sailors were called limeys.
But then but at the time, like, I remember reading about that myself, where they just, by pure happenstance, they figured out that limes helped it out.
Yeah.
But then it became too expensive, so they switched it to, I want to say, oranges? I think it
Perhaps, or
was.
lemons, or some, I don't know.
Some other thing that they didn't have
Okay.
enough vitamin C. And it came back, so. But because at the time, it was all word of mouth.
Right, right, exactly. Okay, so now minerals, these are, anytime you see a plus, that means these are cations, these are ions that are positively charged. Cl, chlorine, negatively charged, okay? And you need certain minerals, like hemoglobin, you need iron. You hear about iron, poor blood, anemia, so you have to supplement with iron. So we also have to get these in our diet. And then there's something, anybody ever hear about antioxidants? Okay, how about free radicals? Okay. Now blueberries are supposedly great antioxidants. What they do is they gobble up free radicals. Free radicals are highly reactive ions that supposedly damage cells. And so if you eat antioxidants, you prevent some of that damage. The thing is, remember, ions are negatively or positively charged. They're all free radicals. They're all necessary for actually doing things. If they weren't positively or negatively charged, they wouldn't, in a gradient, they wouldn't work. Let's say moving from positive to negative, right? Like nerve transmission. So, and no one has actually ever, this is theorized, but no one's actually ever done an experiment. This is the part of, this is why nutrition science is not a science, okay? Nutrition science is to tell you certain things that they say you're not getting, but it's pretty much of a scam if you eat well. Now, if you only eat pancakes, maybe you should take vitamins and minerals. Now, there's fats, of course, and fats they're a great way to store energy. You can turn glucose through pathway into fat, and you can store a lot more energy in fats than in carbohydrates, but we'll get to that. Okay. Now, it turns out that we use fats for a lot of other things. Remember phospholipid bilayer? Well, a lipid is a fat. So we not only need fats, different kinds of fats for storing energy, but for making up the membrane, and also transport proteins like cholesterol, right? Cholesterol is actually a necessary component. Our livers actually make cholesterol. And they actually transport proteins through the blood. So we need fatty acids. So here's the cell membranes. We can synthesize most fatty acids, but those that we cannot, what are they called? Starts with an E. Essential fatty acids, just like essential amino acids, right? Okay. Now, there's unsaturated, which means that these are fats that are liquid at room temperature. And then there's saturated, that we find mainly in animal fat. And supposedly the unsaturated are better for you. The thing is, they recently finally did some studies, and it looks like most of our cholesterol is not from dietary. In other words, let's say you eat a big juicy steak with lots of marbling, or pulled pork, or something that's really greasy, bacon. That will not dump a whole bunch of cholesterol into your blood. The liver makes cholesterol. Now, there is, of course, an indirect route. Probably if you eat a lot of high-energy fat, you tend to have a metabolic syndrome where you're starting to dump cholesterol into the blood. Okay. But the whole idea of maybe fats are bad for you is, it hasn't really been all that well established. Moderation, I would say. Okay. Oh, and saturated fats, they just have straight chain carbons. So, olive oil, vegetable oil, oils found in seeds. Those are all, for the most part, unsaturated. Trans fats is where you actually take something that's liquid at room temperature, hydrogenate it, make it more saturated, like margarine. By the way, margarine is a scam too. You're probably just better off eating butter. You're not getting any more cholesterol just by eating butter than you do margarines. Okay. So supposedly increase your cardiovascular disease, but the newest guidelines have been kind of revised. They haven't said completely, oh, it's okay to eat saturated fats. They've just not made it a big deal anymore because they really don't know. But as I said, we need fats for a lot of things. Steroids, like certain steroid hormones, estrogen, testosterone, and cholesterol, these are all steroids, are all fat-based. They're made of lipids. Now, you've probably heard about, do you have high cholesterol or low cholesterol? There's two different types of cholesterol, high-density lipoproteins, low-density lipoproteins. I should probably write that out. Okay. So that's HDL and LDL is the same thing. So you can see these are actually these kinds of things, like cholesterol, are part protein and part fat, bound to a lipid. LDL is the bad cholesterol, HDL is the good, so you want a high ratio of HDL to LDL. And then, of course, carbs. So, let's see. Fructose, simple sugar. Sucrose is it's a disaccharide. It's got two glucose molecules together. There are then complex carbohydrates where there's long chains, like I mentioned with fats, the same sort of thing. You have a polymer of sugars all strung together, carbohydrates. That's what plants actually do. They fix carbon, and then the mitochondria take that glucose, that's actually when it's been split off, and turn it into energy. And then there's a lot of carbs that aren't really don't do anything for food. They're structural. So Brussels sprouts, they're fiber. Carbohydrates are basically carbon and waters, right? So the basic structure is CX, so many X equals so many carbons. Let's say C6, and then there's water, H2, and then there's also a number of extra oxygens perhaps. So that's the basic structure. Okay, glucose and fructose are monosaccharides. They're the simplest sugars out there. Glucose is the only thing that the brain can actually handle. There's disaccharides like milk sugars, lactose or sucrose. They have to be broken down, right? And then there's these polysaccharides like potatoes and stuff that are long chain carbohydrates that have to be broken down into simple sugars. Okay. Now, and then cellulose we can't digest. Get some bacteria to help us. So the starch down here, that's stuff we can actually eat unless it's the plant has put poisons in it. And then up here is cellulose, the structures that keep plants upright. So dietary fiber, both good for you, cleans out your intestines, all that. Now, animals don't break down cellulose on their own, but there are bacteria that do. So we have bacteria that actually do the job for us. In fact, termites, that's exactly how they eat. They eat wood because the bacteria breaks down the cellulose. Okay. Now, animals store excess carbohydrates, let's say glucose, into something called glycogen. And glycogen is stored in the muscle and liver, and each gram of glycogen is bound by 3 grams of water, so when you burn up glycogen, you actually produce water. And a lot of animals, it turns out, that live in arid environments, that's all the water they need. They make their own water. Your brain can only use carbs, specifically glucose. And then when you exercise, any free-floating carbohydrates in your blood, they're taken up and used. And then, after that, the body starts breaking down glycogen, and then after that, you run out of energy, and you hit a wall, and you're wiped out. But you actually start breaking down proteins, which isn't a good deal. Complex carbohydrates you digest slowly, but, you know, people, it turns out if they want to lose weight now, they go on a Mediterranean diet. But actually, you know, diets, well, we're going to get to that in a second. Okay. So this is the basic glucose metabolism. Now, insulin, anybody know what insulin is? Yeah?
Basically what helps break down the sugars.
Yeah. It actually helps transport the sugars in. So, so here we actually have, we can look at it. Okay, so here's glucose. This is a protein that can transport glucose in to the cell membrane. Insulin receptor, and then the insulin in here starts doing things like making glycogen and other fatty acids, all kinds of different things. So if we actually look, let's see. Insulin binds to a receptor which starts many protein activation cascades. These include translocation of GLUT4 transporter. I'm trying to think, it's probably this. To the plasma membrane and the influx of, it's this actually. Influx of glucose. And then glycogen synthesis and glycolysis are all done with the insulin. Okay, so people who are diabetic, of course, they either don't make insulin or their cells are resistant to insulin. Now, metabolic rate. Some people are couch potatoes. They have low metabolic rate, or they made them have low metabolic rate, or they just do. And then other people can have really high metabolic rates where they burn up, they need more food, but they can do lots of work, you know, like long distance athletes and all that kind of stuff. Metabolic rate is influenced by many factors. The more muscle you have, the higher your metabolic rate. Body weight and composition, activity level, in other words, you just lay around or do you actually move? Genetic makeup, and then the food environment that you're in. In other words, the food quality and the food abundance. Now, we talked about this earlier. In the past, do we live in a food-rich environment or a food-poor environment? Kind of both. After, let's say, early farmers, after a harvest, they had a lot of food. Maybe not the best food, but something. Lots of carbs and lots of calories. And then before the next harvest, they often went through a period of, you know, not so much food. They've eaten most of it. Or there's a drought and there's a famine. And so in that kind of environment, you live in a food insecure environment, right? Food scarcity. Now today, we don't live in an environment like that. If we live in the United States or Europe or Asia, we live in a food-rich environment. Really rich. In fact, we have access to things that you normally would never have access to or rarely have access to if you were a hunter-gatherer. So, in our modern food environment, usually you don't find a source of simple carbohydrates. I mean, berries have a fair amount, obviously, but like something like honey is kind of rare. You certainly don't have processed sugar and drinks with lots of sugar in it. And then fats are the same thing. In the past, we didn't usually have access to lots of fats. Now, some animals had more fats than others. A lot of them had very little, like most deer don't have very much fat at all. Very lean meat. So in the ancestral food environment, sometimes there was enough, and then oftentimes there wasn't enough food. Remember about, okay, so we're going to get to first type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disorder. That means the body is attacking itself. The immune system's body. The body's immune system is attacking itself. In this case, the beta cells in the pancreas, so that eventually they can't produce any more insulin. Rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, multiple sclerosis, all those are examples of autoimmune diseases. We'll get to them later. It's kind of surprising why it happens. It seems like there are more of them now than there used to be. And then type 2 diabetes, which usually people start showing when they're older. And it usually is not necessarily caused by not enough insulin, but the cells are insulin resistant. And it's actually part of a larger, what's called a metabolic syndrome, which kind of coincides with obesity, slower metabolism, arteriosclerosis, a whole bunch of things, right? The question is why, and there's a genetic component to a certain amount, to a certain extent. Well, they've done studies with rat models that mimic kind of obesity and diabetes, type 2. And they put them an experiment where the rats, they put these rats in a food-rich environment where they can have as much calories as they want, and then a food-poor environment. And then they looked at body condition over time, and it turns out in a rich environment, the normal rats, they don't show diabetes. The diabetic rats do. And then in the food-poor environment, the regular rats are malnourished. They die of starvation. Whereas the other ones, the diabetic ones, actually survive. So it looks like, we call it a disorder, but most of our history was in kind of a food insecure environment, at least at certain times of the year, and it looks like having that kind of metabolism, you wouldn't show diabetes, but you would survive the starvation times, whereas the skinny people would all die, right? And you would leave more offspring. So nowadays, of course, you have these metabolic problems that kill you, but usually after you've actually made children, right? So it happens later, and we call it a disorder, but it's just a matter of the food environment has changed. So remember, adaptation, environment, right? Okay. Now, it turns out the cells in our body, they don't actually use glucose. Glucose is part of a synthesis of something called ATP. And ATP is the currency that actually cells use to burn energy. And that's what the mitochondria do. Okay? So ATP, now we don't store ATP. ATP, you use it right away, and you break it down into various different things. One of them is ADP. So ATP is adenine triphosphate. I forget what the other one is. The other one is phosphorylated. But anyway, that's the currency of the cell, is ATP. This is basically what happens. You have glucose, and then and oxygen. So that's why we need oxygen for to burn energy. And you end up with CO2, H2O, and ATP. Okay? So the byproducts of this chemical reaction are CO2, water, and then ATP. And then if you don't have oxygen, you do what's called the fermentation pathway. You start with glucose and you end up with this thing called lactate. Lactic acid builds up in your muscles if you're doing a lot of exercise. ATP, but you don't, anaerobic respiration called glycolysis produces much less ATP than the kind with oxygen. Like you might get, I think, 3 or 4 ATPs versus 30 something. So during aerobic respiration, you break down glucose and from glycogen, break down fatty acids from stored fat. And it's not until you've burned through all of your fat will your body start to break down your own muscle proteins as a source of energy. Okay. And then, as I mentioned, anaerobic, that means without oxygen. You produce some energy, but lots of lactic acid. So once you've depleted your glycogen stores, you've probably heard about marathon runners hitting the wall at about 20 miles, right? And it's because they basically run out of all the carbs that are available. And if they can push through that wall, they'll win the race. Of course, by the end, they're completely, they start breaking down muscle and they're completely wiped out. Okay. Now, calories. Calories are a unit of energy. It's actually a unit that 1 calorie will raise 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade. Okay? And we need energy. There's actually in a pound of fat, 3,500 calories. The thing is, these are big calories, not little calories. So a little calorie is just 1 calorie. A big calorie is 1,000 calories. So that means 3,500 big calories. Okay? Now, of course, a lot of people think about, diets that if I just cut down on the calories in, calories out sort of thing. It doesn't actually work that way, by the way. When a person's body is going through, let's say, a famine, they start shutting down and burning up less energy, right? Slow down the metabolism and try to actually hold on to the fat stores that they have, all that. That's what the body's natural response is. And you hear about all these people who go on a diet, they lose lots of weight, and then after that, they start to gain it back, and then they can't lose it anymore. I mean, they can cut down their diet to almost minuscule, and they're still putting on pounds. And why is this? Well, a diet is actually telling your body that you're now in a famine. And so your body is going to do everything it can to hold on to all those energy stores. It doesn't know any better. I guess you could talk to it. Listen, just get rid of it. We don't need it, I swear. I can go to the market. Eat some fried chicken. Don't worry about it. Okay? Okay. So, anyway, I just want you to know that's why diets tend to be fruitless. Which is bad. Of course, they keep selling you diets that work, and they might work initially, but they tend not to stay that way. It's a terrible bummer. So what you've done is this whole idea of calories in, calories out. If you cut the amount of calories in, you're going to lose weight. Well, a lot of people who have lots of fat, are overweight, what we consider overweight, are actually, their body's hanging on to it. In fact, they're the ones in the old environment who actually survived.
How does your body hang on to it? Does your digestive system slow down, or?
Metabolic rate,
Oh, okay.
it just makes you want to sit around and, not do much. There's a whole bunch of, physiological things that happen. And people who have a naturally low metabolic rate tend to survive those periods. I mean, there's a trade-off here, right? If you have a high metabolic rate, you can burn it, you need a lot of energy, but you can use it very efficiently. There's something called the body mass index. Thank you. And that means you take the weight to the height ratio. So whether it's in kilograms or pounds, pounds to inches, square inches, or square meters, kilograms to square meters. And then the healthy range is anywhere from, let's say, 20 to 25. BMI over 30 is too much. Now, the thing is, it's not really all that great a measure, because let's say you have a very high body mass, like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You've got muscle instead of fat. So muscle weighs a lot more. So you might have a very high BMI when, in fact, you don't have much fat at all. Women need more body fat than men, and that's mainly because of reproduction. So the monthly cycle, if women are in a starvation environment, they usually stop having their periods, or a lot of long-distance runners, they often have intermittent periods because they're burning up so much energy. Hydrostatic weighing, you can actually measure body fat this way. Metabolism does a number of things. Anabolic, which means it builds up like strings together, or breaks down. So synthesis of muscle, storage of fat, that's anabolic. Catabolic means that you're breaking things down, getting energy from it, like glycogen in fast usage. So to do catabolic stuff, you need energy. And let's say you want to build muscle. Well, what you need is you basically fatigue your muscles. You build more protein with amino acids, so you need amino acids. You need energy, like anabolic reactions like ATP. If you don't have enough energy, you're not going to build muscles. So you can't actually build muscles while on a diet. A lot of people, I'll exercise and build muscles and lose weight at the same time. It doesn't quite work that way. Okay. So if I lift heavy weights, I might look like that, maybe. Or maybe this whole, a lot of reps of kind of cardiovascular stuff. Muscle tone. When you think about muscle tone, it's usually a matter of, there's oftentimes a thin layer of fat on top of the muscle, mainly because muscles remember, they need energy, and it's better to have it stored close to the muscle so they can actually use it. Okay. Now, there's a trade-off, and so the main thing you have to realize is efficient muscle building and fat loss are incompatible. That means you really can't do both at the same time. let's say after you lose weight, then you start eating again and you exercise like crazy, and then hopefully you don't gain it back so fast. But that's questionable. I think that's it, isn't it? Yeah, good. Okay. Let's take a break, and then we'll start on something that's a little more fun. At least I think it is.